So today we're going to finish up with the 54 MGTF that had the engine noise. Let's get going. So we do want to take the center main cap out and take a look at this bearing to see what it looks like. But before we do that, we'd like to measure the rod journals here and see what they look like to try to find out, are they oblong, are they tapered, we got something funky going on. But that's a little difficult to do up under the car and film it. So I got this crankshaft out of an MGB just to show you the process of how we're going to check this. Now the proper way to do this is with a good high quality set of micrometers that you know are properly calibrated. Then you actually measure the diameter of this, and then you want to make sure that it's between a specific range of measurements for the given crankshaft you're talking about and the size bearings you're using. So if you walk into a machine shop and you lay your crank on the table, they're going to check it with a mic, and mics are going to have nice wide pads on there to make sure that they stay straight and get a nice accurate measurement. Then as they tighten them up, they actually have a small dial on there that they turn it until it like breaks and doesn't tighten anymore. Kind of like the gas cap on most new cars. You turn it and then it starts clicking. Doesn't allow you to over tighten it. Same thing with mics. That way you get an accurate measurement every single time. Then they compare that to the book of what it should be. Now, the average person's not going to have mics, especially good quality mics, in their garage. So I'm going to show you another method that's a little more crude, but can let you know whether there's a major problem or not. And that's by using a set of calipers, slide calipers. Now, even though this is a really good set here, I would not trust these to be accurate enough to properly measure the actual size. So we're not doing it for the measurement. We're doing it as a comparison. Now, my calipers are dial calipers. So what we can do is you can go ahead and put on here and get it on here and slide it on. But you want to make sure you're perfectly square. If you cock it one way or another, you're going to get varying measurements. See how the needle moves as you move it? Now that would be square, the lowest position, the lowest number. Then you can tighten that up. So you get it to where you know what you're feeling here. It feels really good. You know what you got. Right? While holding it as square as possible from the center here, then you move to the outside, but stay away from the radius that's there. Measure this side and then this side. And you want to make sure that they feel the same in all three positions. And then you want to turn the crank and do it again in another position. But you don't want to be right over top of the oil hole, because if you're right there, it's going to not give you a proper measurement. And you should check it at a minimum and 90 degrees apart from each other, preferably three positions, 120 degrees apart. Now, if you've got a difference in measurement from here to there, where maybe it's good here, feels loose here and tight here, then there's a taper here. And that's not good. It means probably it was machined improperly, especially with a motor that supposedly has a few as miles as the one we're dealing with. Now, if you show it's good here, really tight here, and loose here, well, then it's oblong, not perfectly round. And that's when you know it's time to take it into the machine shop rather than just stuff a set of bearings in it and hope for the best. So at this point in time on the rods, I'm not seeing anything that's given me any great concern. The only one I've noticed any variance on is the very center of, I think, number 4, measured just a hair smaller, looser than the rest. But they felt pretty consistent all the way around. And it was number 2 and 3 were the ones that I was worrying about most. I think it was number 3. I think in the last video I said number 2 was the bad bearing, but it was actually number 3 that showed the most wear. And the journal itself looks okay. Now, when you're rotating all this in place, you gotta be very careful with the rods to not turn it and stick any of the bolts into the journals and make any marks in them. Now, I am questioning this build. The more I know about this car, the more I see and learn, the more worried I am about this thing. Supposedly, some guy that was really, really, really good in town built this motor. Of course, it was 20 years ago. But the information that I have on it and some of the things that I'm seeing makes me question things. Like, these two weights have had quite a bit of grinding on them for balancing. The two center weights haven't even been touched at all. I find that a little odd that these two would need that much and these would need absolutely nothing at all. Plus, the information that the guy has on this car, within his information, he says it supposedly has 1,500 pistons in it, which would be the X-Peg pistons. And as far as I know, that can't even be done because the bore size difference between the 1250 and the 1500 is 187 thousandths. And I don't know of anybody who's been able to bore one of these more than 120 and get away with it. Just another quick note here as I'm taking the cotter pins, or split pins if you will, out of the two centers. The one on this side only has half the cotter pin there. The other half is evidently in the oil pan. So you don't like seeing that either. Okay, so here is the center main cap. We're obviously showing a bit more wear in the mains than we were in the rods. And then we got this here, where the babbitt's starting to come apart and there's a lot of pressure right here on the thrust, except the thrust is this side. So when you push on the clutch, it's pushing against this side, not this side. And when I'm looking at that, look how rough all this was sanded just to put it into the motor to start with. Because these come oversized and you gotta sand them to fit, and that surface looks awful rough on both sides. So I'm gonna say maybe the engine build on this thing wasn't that well done to begin with, and it really does need for the engine to come out and be taken apart and everything gone through to double check it all and correct anything we find. So I went ahead and talked to the owner of the car, and after a little discussion about the possibilities of what we can do and possible outcomes, he has decided, kind of an old school idea, he is an old school racer here, that we are going to go ahead and just slide a fresh set of bearings into the rods, put the sump back on it, and if it makes no noise, then cool, we're good to go. If it does make any noise, then we're going to go ahead, he's going to take it home. Then he's going to strip the nose off of this thing, get the engine out, and then get it back to me at a later date to actually pull it down, go through it properly to see what really is going on with the rest of the engine and what might have been screwed up in the engine build before, and make it all right. So here we are, I got the center main back in place, and I got one of the rods in place. And we do have a set of king bearings here in 10 under, which is what the crank is right now. And the clearance on that one checked at 1.5 thousandths, which puts us right in the range we're looking for. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the other three, get it put back together. So we got all the rod bearings back in place, all the rod caps torqued down, cotter pins put in, all the clearances came out between 1.5 thousandths and 2 thousandths, so that's all acceptable. And it's time to put the oil pan on, but before I put the oil pan on, I wanted to clean out all of the crap that was down in the bottom of it. And if you remember correctly, the paint wasn't exactly in the greatest condition, and after I got it out of the solvent tank, it was even worse. So I hit it with some of the Moth T-Series red, but then that means it had to sit for a good 24 hours to get cured enough to do anything with it before I could start playing with it again. Now these T-Series, one of the things you have to remember about these is the oil pump pickup here comes up and it goes through the pan here, and there's a passageway in the pan, and it pulls the oil up through the pan rail, which means when you're doing the oil pan gaskets, it's a bit more important than just keeping it from dripping out the side of the oil pan. You gotta make sure it seals really good right around this area here. So you want this nice and clean. You want to make sure the gasket's in good condition, or even pay a little bit of attention to put a little bit of sealer. Even if you don't like using sealer on both sides of it, still put a little bit around this area maybe to make sure that it's not sucking any air. There's also a gasket right there. You want to make sure that's sealing properly, and then it's got 2 bolts that go through here. It holds that in place, and those get safety wired in. Now I haven't tightened none of this yet, so it's obviously not safety wired yet because I still got to clean the rails yet, which means this isn't permanently installed yet. So I got the sump back on it here and got the oil filter put back together. Now this is the late style oil pump that all the TFs had and the later TDs had. Now for those of you who don't know, this X-Pack engine is an external oil pump. Now one thing that's nice about these is once you've had the oil pan off of it, or if you've just built a fresh engine, you can actually take this plug right here out, and that is a plug to prime the oil pump with. So you can fill the gears with oil to make sure that it gets suction. But we also have a plug right here. You can put oil in there and pre-fill the oil filter, and I think some of that oil will actually go back into the block too to fill some of the oil galleys. So that way you get oil pressure really quickly when you start trying to crank it up. So I got the oil pump primed, oil filter filled, oil in the sump. I've cranked it over enough that we got oil pressure on the gauge. And while I was doing that, I went ahead and did a compression check on it out of curiosity. And actually it's got, let's see, 155, 144, 116, and 135, which is not exactly the kind of numbers we're looking for when you have a car that's supposed to have this few miles on the engine. So just another one of those question marks over this thing. I'm leaving the belt off of it for now. We'll get it to fire over, see what it sounds like, and then I'll put the belt on and see if it changes, and then we'll know if the water pump's actually making any noise as well. This thing should start really quickly because I've cranked it over enough. There's fuel in it. I actually got it to just kind of go buzz real quickly. So it should just fire right up. Sitting right at 50 pounds of oil pressure. It is still a noisy motor, but a completely different noise than it had before. Or maybe not completely, but this thing always did have kind of a loud engine in it. I think I remember when I had this in before, it did have kind of a noisy engine, which makes me think that that it really needs mains put in it, and I'll bet the balance of this motor is really, really bad. But we'll see from here moving forward. I'll go ahead and put the belt on, see if it makes any difference. I'll start hooking up all the clutch stuff and see if there's any differences. But yeah, Not exactly happy with it, but it's an improvement over what we had. So for those of you in the comment sections were saying it's definitely a knock, or that any mechanic could diagnose as a rod knock from 30 yards away. Are you still certain that it's a rod knock? Or do you think it's something a little deeper?